This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography.
Produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 63. Conversion or Compulsion. 16 years ago, Gandhiji impressed India with his doctrine of nonviolence. Ever since then, it has dominated the Indian horizon. Vast numbers of people have repeated it unthinkingly, but with approval. Some have wrestled with it and then accepted it, with or without reservation. Some have openly jeered at it. It has played a major part in our political and social life, and it has also attracted a great deal of attention in the wider world. The doctrine is, of course, almost as old as human thought, but perhaps Gandhiji was the first to apply it on a mass scale to political and social movements. Formerly it was an individual affair and was thus essentially religious. It was the restraint of the individual and his attempt to achieve complete disinterestedness, and thus to raise himself above the level of worldly conflict and attain a kind of personal freedom and salvation. There was no idea behind it of dealing with the larger serial problems and of changing social conditions, except very indirectly and remotely. There was almost an acceptance of the existing social fabric with all its inequality and injustice. Gandhiji tried to make this individual ideal into a social group ideal. He was out to change political conditions as well as social, and deliberately, with this end in view, he applied the non-violent method on this wider and wholly different plane. Those who have to bring about radical changes in human conditions and surroundings, he has written, cannot do it except by raising a ferment in society. There are only two methods of doing this, violent and non-violent. Violent pressure is felt on the physical being, and it degrades him who uses it as it depresses the victim, but non-violent pressure exerted through self-suffering, as by fasting, works in an entirely different way. It touches not the physical body, but it touches and strengthens the moral fiber of those against whom it is directed. These extracts are from a statement made by Gandhiji on December 4, 1932, on the occasion of one of his fasts. The idea was to some extent in harmony with Indian thought, and it was accepted, superficially at least, with enthusiasm by the country. Very few realized the far-reaching implications that lay behind it, and the few who did so rather vaguely took refuge in faith and action. But when the tempo of action slackened, innumerable questions arose in the minds of some people, and it was extraordinarily difficult to find answers to them. These questions did not affect the immediate course that had to be followed in politics. Rather, they dealt with the whole philosophy that lay behind this idea of non-violent resistance. In a political sense, the non-violent movement has not succeeded so far, for India is still held in the vice-like grip of imperialism. In a social sense, it has not even envisaged a radical change. And yet anyone with the slightest penetration can see that it has worked a remarkable change in India's millions. It has given them character, strength and self-reliance, precious gifts without which any progress, political or social, is difficult to achieve or to retain. How far these undoubted gains are due to non-violence or to the fact of conflict itself, it is difficult to say. Such gains have been achieved by various peoples on numerous occasions through violent conflict. Yet it may be said, I think with confidence, that the non-violent method has been of inestimable value to us in this respect. It has definitely helped in raising that ferment in society to which Gandhiji refers, though undoubtedly that ferment was due to basic causes and conditions. It has brought about that quickening process in the masses that precedes revolutionary change. That is an obvious point in its favor, but it does not carry us far. The real questions remain unanswered. Unfortunately, Gandhiji does not help us much in solving the problem. He has written and spoken on innumerable occasions on the subject, but so far as I know, he has never considered in public all its implications, philosophically or scientifically. Footnote: Richard B. Gregg in his The Power of Nonviolence has discussed the subject scientifically. His book is most interesting and thought-provoking. End of footnote. Gandhiji lays stress on the means being more important than the end, of conversion being better than coercion, and there is a tendency to identify non-violence with truth and all goodness. Indeed, he often uses the terms as if they were synonymous. There is also the tendency to consider all those who may not agree with this as outside the pale of the elect, and as having offended against the moral law. In the case of some of his followers, this translates itself inevitably into a feeling of self-righteousness. Those of us who are not fortunate enough to have this faith are, however, troubled with a host of doubts. These doubts do not relate so much to immediate necessities, but to the mind's desire for some consistent philosophy of action which is both moral from the individual viewpoint and is at the same time socially effective. I confess that these doubts have not left me, and I see no satisfactory solution of the problem. I dislike violence intensely, and yet I am full of violence myself, and consciously or unconsciously I am often attempting to coerce others. And can anything be greater coercion than the psychic coercion of Gandhiji, which reduces many of his intimate followers and colleagues to a state of mental pulp? But the real question was, can national and social groups imbibe sufficiently this individual creed of nonviolence, for it involved a tremendous rise of mankind in the mass to a high level of love and goodness. It is true that the only really desirable ultimate ideal is to raise humanity to this level and to abolish hatred and ugliness and selfishness. Whether that is possible or not, even ultimately, may be a debatable question. But without that to hope for life would almost become a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. To attain this ideal, are we to work for it directly by preaching these virtues, regardless of the obstructions which make it impossible of achievement and which encourage every contrary tendency? Or must we not remove these obstructions first and create a more suitable and more favorable environment for the growth of love, beauty, goodness? Or can we combine the two processes, and then again is the line between violence and non-violence, compulsion and conversion, so obvious? Often enough moral force is a far more terrible coercive factor than physical violence, and is non-violence synonymous with truth? What is truth is an ancient question to which 1,000 answers have been given, and yet the question remains. But whatever it may be, it cannot certainly be wholly identified with non-violence. Violence itself, though bad, cannot be considered intrinsically immoral. There are shades and grades of it, and often it may be preferable to something that is worse. Gandhiji himself has said that it is better than cowardice, fear, and slavery, and a host of other evils might be added to this list. It is true that usually violence is associated with ill will, but in theory at least this need not always be so. It is conceivable that violence may be based on goodwill, that of a surgeon, for example, and anything that has this for a basis can never be fundamentally immoral. After all, the final tests of ethics and morality are goodwill and ill will. Thus, although violence is very often unjustifiable morally and may be considered dangerous from that viewpoint, it need not always be so. All life is full of conflict and violence, and it seems to be true that violence breeds violence and is thus not a way to overcome it. And yet to forswear it altogether leads to an wholly negative attitude utterly out of touch with life itself. Violence is the very lifeblood of the modern state and social system. Without the coercive apparatus of the state, taxes would not be realized, landlords would not get their rents, and private property would disappear. The law, with the help of its armed forces, excludes others from the use of private property. The national state itself exists because of offensive and defensive violence. Gandhiji's non-violence, it is true, is certainly not a purely negative affair. It is not non-resistance. It is non-violent resistance, which is a very different thing, a positive and dynamic method of action. It was not meant for those who meekly accept the status quo. The very purpose for which it was designed was to create a ferment in society and thus to change existing conditions. Whatever the motives of conversion behind it, in practice it has been a powerful weapon of compulsion as well, though that compulsion is exercised in the most civilized and least objectionable manner. Indeed, it is interesting to note that Gandhiji actually used the word compel in his earlier writings. Criticizing the Viceroy's, Lord Chelmsford's speech in 1920 on the Punjab martial law wrongs, he wrote, "The speech His Excellency delivered at the time of the opening of the Council shows to me a mental attitude which makes association with him or his government impossible for self-respecting men." The remarks on the Punjab mean a flat refusal to grant redress. He would have us to concentrate on the problems of the immediate future. The immediate future is to compel repentance on the part of the government on the Punjab matter. Of this there is no sign. On the contrary, His Excellency resists the temptation to reply to his critics, meaning thereby that he has not changed his opinion on the many vital matters affecting the honour of India. He is content to leave the issues to the verdict of history. Now this kind of language, in my opinion, is calculated further to inflame the Indian mind. Of what use can a favourable verdict of history be to men who have been wronged and who are still under the heels of officers who have shown themselves utterly unfit to hold offices of trust and responsibility? The plea for cooperation is, to say the least, hypocritical in the face of the determination to refuse justice to the Punjab. Governments are notoriously based on violence, not only the open violence of the armed forces, but the far more dangerous violence, more subtly exercised, of spies, informers, agents provocateurs, false propaganda, direct and indirect through education, press, etc., religious and other forms of fear, economic destitution, and starvation. As between two governments, it is taken for granted that every manner of falsehood and treachery is justified, provided it is not found out, even in peacetime, and much more so in wartime. 300 years ago, Sir Henry Wotton, a poet and himself a British ambassador, defined an ambassador as an honest man sent to lie abroad for the good of his country. Nowadays, ambassadors are supported by military, naval, and commercial attachés whose chief function is to spy in the country to which they are sent. Behind them functions the vast network of the Secret Service, with its innumerable ramifications and webs of intrigue and deception, its spies and counter-spies, its connections with the underworld of crime, its bribery and degradation of human nature, its secret murders. Bad as all this is in peacetime, war gives it enormous importance and its baneful influence spreads in every direction. It is astonishing to read now of some of the instances of propaganda during the World War, the amazing falsehoods spread about enemy countries, the vast sums spent on this and on the secret services. But peace today is itself merely an interval between two wars, a preparation for war, and to some extent a continuation of the conflict in economic and other spheres. There is a continuous tug-of-war between the victors and the vanquished, between the imperialist powers and their colonial dependencies, between the privileged classes and the exploited classes. The war atmosphere, with all its accompaniments of violence and falsehood, continues in some measure, therefore, even during so-called peacetime. And both the soldier and the civilian official are trained to meet this situation. Lord Wolseley writes in the Soldier's Pocketbook for Field Service, "We will keep hammering along with the conviction that honesty is the best policy and that truth always wins in the long run." These pretty sentences do well for a child's copybook, but the man who acts upon them in war had better sheath his sword forever. Under present conditions, with nation against nation and class against class, this basis of violence and falsehood seems almost inevitable. Privileged nations and groups, desirous of holding on to their power and privileges and denying those whom they oppress the opportunities of growth, must rely on violence, coercion, and falsehood. It may be possible, as public opinion grows and the realities of these conflicts and their suppression become more manifest, for the violence to be toned down. As a matter of fact, all recent experience points to the contrary, and violence has grown as the challenge to existing institutions has gained weight. Even when outward violence has been toned down, it has taken subtler and more dangerous forms. Neither the growth of reason, nor of the religious outlook, nor morality have checked in any way this tendency to violence. Individuals have progressed and gone up in the human scale, and probably there are far more of these higher type individuals, the highest type accepted in the world today, than at any previous period of history. Society as a whole has progressed, and to a very small extent begun to attempt the control of the primitive and barbarian instincts. But on the whole, groups and communities have not improved greatly. The individual, in becoming more civilized, has passed on many of his primitive passions and vices to the community, and as violence always attracts the morally second-rate, the leaders of these communities are seldom their best men and women. But even if we assume that the worst forms of violence will be gradually removed from the state, it is impossible to ignore the fact that both government and social life necessitate some coercion. Social life necessitates some form of government, and the men so placed in authority must curb and prevent all individual or group tendencies which are inherently selfish and likely to injure society. Usually they go much further than necessary, for power corrupts and degrades, so that however much those rulers may love liberty and hate coercion, they will have to exercise coercion on recalcitrant individuals, till such time when every human being in that state is perfect, wholly unselfish, and devoted to the common good. The rulers of that state will also have to exercise coercion on outside groups who make predatory attacks. That is to say, they will have to defend themselves, meeting force with force. The necessity for this will only disappear when there is only a single world state. If force and coercion are thus necessary both for external defense and internal cohesion, where is one to draw the line? Once this fateful concession is made of ethics to politics, and coercion is accepted as a necessary instrument of social cohesion, Reinhold Niebuhr points out in Moral Man and Immoral Society, it is not possible to make absolute distinctions between non-violent and violent types of coercion, or between the coercion used by governments and that used by revolutionaries. I do not know for certain, but I imagine that Gandhiji will admit that in this imperfect world a national state will have to use force to defend itself against unprovoked attack from outside. Of course, the state should allow an absolutely peaceful and friendly policy to its neighbor and other states, but nevertheless it is absurd to deny the possibility of attack. The state will also have to pass some laws of a coercive nature, in the sense that they take away some rights and privileges from various classes and groups and restrict liberty of action. All laws are to some extent coercive. The Karachi program of the Congress lays down that, in order to end the exploitation of the masses, political freedom must include real economic freedom of the starving millions. To give effect to this desirable sentiment, the overprivileged will have to give up much to the underprivileged. Further, it is laid down that workers must have a living wage and various other amenities, that special taxes will be charged on property, that the state shall own or control key industries and services, mineral resources, railways, waterways, shipping, and other means of public transport. Also that intoxicating drinks and drugs shall be totally prohibited. All this is likely to be objected to by considerable numbers of people. They may submit to the will of the majority, but that will be because they are afraid of the consequences of disobedience. Democracy indeed means the coercion of the minority by the majority. If a law affecting property rights or abolishing them to a large extent is passed by a majority, is that to be objected to because it is coercion? Manifestly not, because the same procedure is followed in the adoption of all democratic laws. Objection, therefore, cannot be taken on the ground of coercion. It might be said that the majority was acting wrongly or immorally. The question to be considered then is, whether the law as passed by a majority offended any ethical principle. Who is to decide this? If individuals and groups are allowed to interpret ethics in accordance with their own interests, there is an end of democratic procedure. Personally, I feel that the institution of private property, except in a very restricted sense, gives dangerous power to individuals over society as a whole, and is therefore very harmful to society. I consider it immoral, far more so than drink, which harms the individual more than society. I have been told, however, by some people who claim to believe in the doctrine of nonviolence that to attempt to nationalize private property, except with the consent of the owners thereof, would be coercion, and as such opposed to nonviolence. Indeed, this viewpoint has been impressed upon me by big zamindars who do not scruple to take the aid of the state in forcibly collecting their rents, and capitalists owning many factories, who will not even permit independent labor unions to exist in their domains. The fact that a majority of the people affected desires the change is not considered enough. The very people who stand to lose by it should be converted. Thus a few interested parties can hold up an obviously desirable change. If there is one thing that history shows, it is this: that economic interests shape the political views of groups and classes. Neither reason nor moral considerations override these interests. Individuals may be converted, they may surrender their special privileges, although this is rare enough, but classes and groups do not do so. The attempt to convert a governing and privileged class into forsaking power and giving up its unjust privileges has therefore always so far failed, and there seems to be no reason whatever to hold that it will succeed in the future. Reinhold Niebuhr, in his book Moral Man and Immoral Society, directs his argument against the moralists who imagine that the egoism of individuals is being progressively checked by the development of rationality or the growth of a religiously inspired goodwill, and that nothing but the continuance of this process is necessary to establish social harmony between all the human societies and collectives. These moralists disregard the political necessities in the struggle for justice in human society by failing to recognize those elements in man's collective behavior which belong to the order of nature and can never be brought completely under the dominion of reason or conscience. They do not recognize that when collective power, whether in the form of imperialism or class domination, exploits weakness, it can never be dislodged unless power is raised against it. And again, since reason is always, to some degree, the servant of interest in a social situation, social justice cannot be resolved by moral or rational suasion alone. Conflict is inevitable, and in this conflict power must be challenged by power. To think, therefore, in terms of pure conversion of a class or nation, or of the removal of conflict by rational argument and appeals to justice, is to delude oneself. It is an illusion to imagine that a dominant imperialist power will give up its domination over a country, or that a class will give up its superior position and privileges unless effective pressure, amounting to coercion, is exercised. Gandhiji obviously wants to apply that pressure, though he does not call it coercion. According to him, his method is self-suffering. It is a little difficult to consider this, as there is a metaphysical element in it, and it does not yield to measurement or any other material approach. That it has considerable effect on the opponent is undoubted. It exposes his moral defenses, it unnerves him, it appeals to the best in him, it leaves the door open for conciliation. There can be no doubt that the approach of love and self-suffering has powerful psychic reactions on the adversary as well as on the onlookers. Most shikaris know that it makes a difference how one approaches a wild animal. He seems to sense the aggressive spirit from afar and reacts to it. Even a suspicion of fear in the man, hardly realized by him, is conveyed somehow to the animal and makes him afraid, and in this fear he attacks. If the nerve of a lion tamer fail him for an instant, there is immediate danger of his being attacked. An absolutely fearless man is seldom in danger from wild animals, unless some untoward accident occurs. It seems natural, therefore, that human beings should be susceptible to these psychic influences. But though individuals may be affected, it is doubtful if a class or group is affected. That class, as a class, does not come into personal and intimate contact with the other party. Even the reports it hears are partial and distorted. And in any event, its automatic reaction of anger against any group that challenges its position is so great that all minor feelings are swallowed up in it. Having for long accustomed itself to the notion that its superior position and privileges were necessary for the good of society, any contrary opinion savours of heresy. Law and order and the maintenance of the status quo become the chief virtues, and attempts to challenge them the chief sins. So that, so far as the opposite group is concerned, the process of conversion does not go far. Indeed, sometimes the very mildness and saintliness of their adversary makes them angrier still, for it seems to put them in the wrong. And when a person begins to suspect that he might be in the wrong, his virtuous indignation grows. Nevertheless, a non-violent technique does affect odd individuals on the other side, and thereby weakens the solidity of opposition. Even more so, it gains the sympathy of neutrals and is a powerful means of influencing world opinion. But here again there is the probability of the governing group preventing the news from going out, or of distorting it, because it controls the agencies of publicity and can thus prevent the real facts from being known. The most potent and far-reaching effect of the non-violent method is, however, on the large numbers of more or less indifferent people of the country in which this technique is practiced. They are certainly converted and often become enthusiasts in its favor, but then they did not require much conversion as they generally approved of the object aimed at. The effect is not so obvious on those who dread the change. The rapid spread of non-cooperation and civil disobedience in India was a demonstration of how a non-violent movement exercises a powerful influence on vast numbers and converts many waverers. It did not convert to any marked extent those who were ab initio hostile to it. Indeed, the success of the movement increased their fears and made them even more hostile. If it is once admitted that a state is justified in using violence to defend its freedom, it is difficult to understand why it is not equally justified in adopting violent and coercive methods in trying to achieve that freedom. A violent method may be undesirable and inexpedient, but it would not be wholly unjustifiable and barred. The mere fact that a government happens to be the dominant faction controlling the armed forces does not give it a greater right to the use of violence. In the event of a non-violent revolution succeeding and controlling the state, does it immediately acquire the right to use violence, which it did not possess before? If there is an insurrection against its authority, how is it going to meet it? It will naturally be disinclined to use violent methods, and will try every peaceful way to meet the situation, but it cannot give up the right to use violence. There are sure to be disaffected elements in the population opposed to the change, and they will try to go back to the previous condition. If they think that their violence will not be checked by the coercive apparatus of the new state, they are all the more likely to indulge in it. It seems, therefore, that it is quite impossible to draw a hard and fast line between violence and non-violence, coercion and conversion. The difficulty is real enough in considering political changes. It becomes far worse as between privileged and exploited classes. To suffer for an ideal has always commanded admiration. To submit to suffering for a cause without giving in or hitting back has a nobility and grandeur in it which force recognition. And yet there is only a thin line which divides this from suffering for suffering's sake, and this latter kind of self-suffering is apt to become morbid and even a little degrading. If violence is often sadistic, non-violence in its negative aspects at least is likely to err on the other side. There is also always the possibility for non-violence to be made a cloak for cowardice and inaction, as well as the maintenance of the status quo. During the past few years in India, ever since the idea of radical social changes has assumed importance here, it has often been stated that such a change necessarily involves the use of violence and cannot therefore be advocated. Class conflicts must not be mentioned, however much they might exist, because they jar on the vision of perfect cooperation, and a non-violent progress to whatever goal might lie in the future. It is quite possible that a solution of the social problem cannot be brought about without violence at some stage, for it seems certain that the privileged classes will not hesitate to use violence to maintain their favored position. But in theory, if it is possible to bring about a great political change by a non-violent technique, why should it not be equally possible to effect a radical social change by this method? If we can get political freedom and the elimination of British imperialism from India non-violently, why should we not also solve the problem of the feudal princes and landlords and other social problems in the same way and establish a socialist state? Whether all this is possible or not, non-violently, is not so much the question. The point is that either both of these objectives are possible of attainment non-violently, or neither. Surely it cannot be said that a non-violent method can only be used against a foreign ruler. Prima facie, it should be far easier to use it within a country against indigenous selfish interests and obstructionists, for the psychological effect on them will be greater than elsewhere. The recent tendency in India to condemn objectives and policies simply because they are supposed to conflict with non-violence seems to me an inversion of the right method of looking at such problems. We took to the non-violent method 15 years ago because it promised to take us to our goal in the most desirable and effective way. The goal was then apart from non-violence. It was not a mere appendage or outcome of it. No one could have said then that freedom or independence must only be aimed at if they are attainable by non-violent means. But now our goal itself is judged in terms of non-violence and rejected if it does not seem to fit in with it. The idea of non-violence is thus becoming an inflexible dogma which may not be challenged. As such, it is losing its spiritual appeal to the intellect and taking its place in the pigeonholes of faith and religion. It is even becoming a sheet anchor for vested interests who exploit it to maintain the status quo. This is unfortunate, for I do believe the ideas of non-violent resistance and the non-violent technique of struggle are of great value to India as well as to the rest of the world, and Gandhiji has done a tremendous service in forcing modern thought to consider them. I believe they have a great future before them. It may be that mankind is not sufficiently advanced to adopt them in their entirety. "You offer your candle of vision to the blind," says a character in A.E.'s Interpreters. But what use can it be to the blind except as a bludgeon? For the present, the vision may not materialize sufficiently, but like all great ideas, its influence will grow and it will more and more affect our actions. Non-cooperation, the withdrawal of cooperation from a state or society which is considered evil, is a powerful and dynamic notion. Even if a handful of persons of moral worth practice it, its effect spreads and goes on increasing. With large numbers, the external effect becomes more marked, but there is a tendency for other factors to obscure the moral issue. The extension of it seems to affect its intensity. The collective man gradually pushes back the individual. The stress, however, on pure nonviolence has made it something remote and apart from life, and there is a tendency for people either to accept it blindly and religiously or not at all. The intellectual element has receded into the background. In 1920 it had a great effect on the terrorists in India and drew many away from their ranks, and even those who remained were held back by doubt and stopped their violent activities. It has no such influence on them now. Even within the Congress ranks, many of the vital elements who played a notable part in the non-cooperation and civil disobedience movements, and in all sincerity tried to live up to the implications of the non-violent method, are now considered as heretics who have no business to continue as congressmen because they are not prepared to make non-violence a creed and a religion, or to give up the only goal they consider worth striving for, a socialist state with equal justice and opportunity for all, a planned society which can only come into existence with the abolition of most of the privileges and property rights that exist today. Gandhiji, of course, continues to be a vital force whose non-violence is of a dynamic and aggressive character, and no one knows when he might again galvanize the country in a forward movement. With all his greatness and his contradictions and power of moving masses, he is above the usual standards. One cannot measure him or judge him as we would others. But many of those who claim to follow him tend to become ineffectual pacifists or non-resistors of the Tolstoyan variety, or just members of a narrow sea, not in touch with life and reality. And they gather round themselves quite a number of people who are interested in maintaining the present order, and who take shelter under nonviolence for this purpose. Opportunism thus creeps in, and the process of converting the adversary leads, in the interests of nonviolence, to one's own conversion and lining up with the adversary. When enthusiasm wanes and we weaken, there is always a tendency to go back a little, to compromise, and it is comforting to call this the art of winning over the opponent. And sometimes we make this gain at the cost of our own old colleagues. We deprecate their extravagances, their utterances that irritate our new friends, and accuse them of breaking the unity of our ranks. Instead of a real change of the social order, stress is laid on charity and benevolence within the existing system, the vested interests remaining where they were. I am convinced that Gandhiji has done a great service to us by stressing the importance of the means, and yet I feel sure that the final emphasis must necessarily be on the end and goal in view. Unless we can conceive that, clearly we can never be anything but aimless wanderers, wasting our energies on unimportant side issues. But the means cannot be ignored, for, quite apart from the moral side, they have a practical side. Bad and immoral means often defeat the end in view or raise tremendous new problems. And, after all, it is the means that a person adopts and not the end he declares that enables us to judge him truly. To adopt means that leads to needless conflict and to the piling up of hatreds is likely to make the achievement of the goal more difficult and distant. End and means are indeed so intimately connected that they can hardly be separated. Essentially, therefore, the means must be such as lessen conflict and hatred, or at any rate try to limit them as far as possible, for they seem to be inevitable, and to encourage goodwill. It becomes more a question of motive and intention and temper than of any particular method. It is on this basic motive that Gandhiji's stress has been, and if he has failed to change human nature to any appreciable extent, he succeeded surprisingly in impressing this motive on a great national movement involving millions. His insistence on strict moral discipline was also very necessary, though his standards of that individual discipline are perhaps debatable. He attaches vast importance to the self-regarding sins or failings and very little to social sins. The necessity for this discipline is obvious, for the temptation to leave the wilderness and join the privileged groups in the seats of power has drawn away many a congressman. For a noted congressman, the door to that favored land is always open. The whole world is in the grip today of various crises, but the greatest of these is the crisis of the spirit. This is especially so in the East, for recent changes in Asia have been more rapid than elsewhere, and the process of adjustment is painful. The political problem which seems to dominate the situation is perhaps the least important of all, though it is the primary problem for us, and it must be disposed of satisfactorily before the real questions are tackled. For ages past we have been accustomed to an almost unchanging basic social order, and many of us still believe that it is the only possible and rightful basis of society, and associate our moral notions with it. But our attempts to fit in the past with the present fail, as they are bound to do. In the last resort, wrote Veblen, the American economist, the economic moralities wait on the economic necessities. The necessities of today will force us to formulate a new morality in accordance with them. If we are to find a way out of this crisis of the spirit and realize what are the true spiritual values today, we shall have to face the issues frankly and boldly, and not take refuge under the dogmas of any religion. What religion says may be good or bad, but the way it says it and wants us to believe it is certainly not conducive to an intellectual consideration of any problem. as Freud has pointed out in The Future of an Illusion, that the dogmas of religion deserve to be believed, firstly, because our primal ancestors already believed them; secondly, because we possess proofs which have been handed down to us from this very period of antiquity; and thirdly, because it is forbidden to raise the question of their authenticity at all. If we consider nonviolence and all it implies from the religious, dogmatic point of view, there is no room for argument. It reduces itself to the narrow creed of a sect which people may or may not accept. It loses vitality and application to present-day problems. But if we are prepared to discuss it in relation to existing conditions, it can help us greatly in our attempts to refashion this world. This consideration must take into account the nature and weaknesses of collective man. Any activity on a mass scale, and especially any activity aiming at radical and revolutionary changes, is affected not only by what the leaders think of it, but by existing conditions and, still more, by what the human material they work with thinks about it. Violence has played a great part in the world's history. It is today playing an equally important part, and probably it will continue to do so for a considerable time. Most of the changes in the past have been caused by violence and coercion. W. E. Gladstone once said, "I am sorry to say that if no instructions had been addressed in political crises to the people of this country, except to remember to hate violence, to love order, and to exercise patience, the liberties of this country would never have been attained." It is impossible to ignore the importance of violence in the past and present. To do so is to ignore life. Yet violence is undoubtedly bad and brings an unending trail of evil consequences with it. And worse even than violence are the motives of hatred, cruelty, revenge, and punishment which very often accompany violence. Indeed, violence is bad not intrinsically, but because of these motives that go with it. There can be violence without these motives. There can be violence for a good object as well as for an evil object. But it is extremely difficult to separate violence from those motives, and therefore it is desirable to avoid violence as far as possible. In avoiding it, however, one cannot accept a negative attitude of submitting to other and far greater evils. Submission to violence or the acceptance of an unjust regime based on violence is the very negation of the spirit of nonviolence. The nonviolent method, in order to justify itself, must be dynamic and capable of changing such a regime or social order. Whether it can do so or not, I do not know. It can, I think, carry us a long way, but I doubt if it can take us to the final goal. In any event, some form of coercion seems to be inevitable, for people who hold power and privilege do not give them up till they are forced to do so, or till conditions are created which make it more harmful to them to keep these privileges than to give them up. The present conflicts in society, national as well as class conflicts, can never be resolved except by coercion. Conversion, of course, there must be on a large scale, for so long as large numbers are not converted, there can be no real basis for a movement of social change. But coercion over some will follow. Nor is it right for us to cover up these basic conflicts and try to make out that they do not exist. That is not only a suppression of the truth, but it directly leads to bolstering up the existing order by misleading people as to the true facts, and giving the ruling classes the moral basis which they are always seeking in order to justify their special privileges. In order to combat an unjust system, the false premises on which it is based must be exposed and the reality laid bare. One of the virtues of non-cooperation is that it exposes these false premises and lies by our refusal to submit to them or to cooperate in their furtherance. Our final aim can only be a classless society with equal economic justice and opportunity for all, a society organized on a planned basis for the raising of mankind to higher material and cultured levels, to a cultivation of spiritual values, of cooperation, unselfishness, the spirit of service, the desire to do right, goodwill, and love, ultimately a world order. Everything that comes in the way will have to be removed, gently if possible, forcibly if necessary. And there seems to be little doubt that coercion will often be necessary. But if force is used, it should not be in the spirit of hatred or cruelty, but with the dispassionate desire to remove an obstruction. That will be difficult. It is not an easy task. There is no easy way, and the pitfalls are numerous. The difficulties and pitfalls do not disappear by our ignoring them, but by realizing their true nature and facing them boldly. All this sounds fanciful and utopian, and it is highly unlikely that many people will be moved by these noble motives. But we can keep them in view and stress them, and it may be that gradually they will lessen the hatreds and passions that fill most of us. Our methods must lead to this goal and be based on these motives. But we must also realize that human nature being what it is in the mass, it will not always respond to our appeals and persuasions or act in accordance with high moral principles. Compulsion will often be necessary in addition to conversion, and the best we can do is to limit this compulsion and use it in such a manner that its evil is lessened. End of Chapter 63. Chapter 64. DEHRA Jail Again. I was not flourishing in Alipore jail. My weight had gone down considerably, and the Calcutta air and increasing heat were distressing me. There were rumors of my transfer to a better climate. On May 7th, I was told to gather my belongings and to march out of the jail. I was being sent to Dehradun jail. The drive through Calcutta in the cool evening air was very pleasant after some months of seclusion, and the crowds at the big Howrah station were fascinating. I was glad of my transfer and looked forward to Dehradun with its nearby mountains. On arrival, I found that all was not as it used to be 9 months earlier, when I had left it for Naini. I was put in a new place, an old cattle shed cleaned up and fitted out. As a cell it was not bad, and there was a little veranda attached to it. There was also a small yard adjoining, about 50 feet in length. The cell was better than the ancient one I had had previously in DEHRA, but soon I discovered that other changes were not for the better. The surrounding wall, which had been 10 feet high, had just been raised, especially for my benefit, by another 4 or 5 feet. The view of the hills I had so looked forward to was completely cut off, and I could just see a few treetops. I was in this jail for over 3 months, and I never had even a glimpse of the mountains. I was not allowed to walk outside in front of the jail gate as I used to, and my little yard was considered quite big enough for exercise. These and other new restrictions were disappointing, and I felt irritated. I grew listless and disinclined to take even the little exercise that my yard allowed. I had hardly ever felt quite so lonely and cut off from the world. The solitary confinement began to tell on my nerves, and physically and mentally I declined. On the other side of the wall, only a few feet away, I knew there was freshness and fragrance, the cool smell of grass and soft earth and distant vistas. But they were all out of reach, and my eyes grew weary and heavy, faced always by those walls. There was not even the usual movement of prison life, for I was kept apart and by myself. After 6 weeks the monsoon broke and it rained in torrents. We had 12 inches of rain during the first week. There was a change in the air and whisperings of new life. The temperature came down and the body felt relaxed and relieved. But there was no relief for the eyes or the mind. Sometimes the iron door of my yard would open to allow a warder to come in or go out, and for a few seconds I had a sudden glimpse of the outside world, green fields and trees, bright with color and glistening with pearly drops of rain, for a moment only, and then it all vanished like a flash of lightning. The door was hardly ever fully opened. Apparently the warders had instructions not to open it if I was anywhere near, and even when they opened it, to do so just a little. These brief glimpses of greenery and freshness were hardly welcome to me. That sight produced in me a kind of nostalgia, a heartache, and I would even avoid looking out when the door opened. But all this unhappiness was not really the fault of the jail, though it contributed to it. It was the reaction of outside events, Kamla's illness, and my political worries. I was beginning to realize that Kamla was again in the grip of her old disease, and I felt helpless and unable to be of any service to her. I knew that my presence by her side would have made a difference. Unlike Alipur, Dehradun jail allowed me a daily newspaper, and I could keep in touch with political and other developments outside. In Patna, the All India Congress Committee met after nearly 3 years. For most of this time it was unlawful, and its proceedings were depressing. It surprised me that no attempt was made at this first meeting, after so much that had happened in India and the world, to analyze the situation, to have full discussions, to try to get out of old ruts. Gandhiji seemed to be, from a distance, his old dictatorial self. "If you choose to follow my lead, you have to accept my conditions," he said. His demand was perfectly natural, for one could not both have him and ask him to act against his own deeply felt convictions. But there seemed too much of imposition from above and too little of mutual discussion and hammering out a policy. It is curious how Gandhiji dominates the mind and then complains of the helplessness of people. Few people, I suppose, have had more loyal devotion and obedience on the mass scale than he has had, and it seems hardly fair to blame the masses for not coming up to the high standard he had set for them. At the Patna meeting he did not even stay till the end, as he had to continue his Harijan tour. He told the AICC to be businesslike and to adopt the resolutions placed before them by the working committee with speed, and then he went away. It is probably true that prolonged discussions would not have improved matters. There was a confusion and want of clarity among the members, and though many were prepared to criticize, there were hardly any constructive suggestions. Under the circumstances this was natural, for the burden of the struggle had largely fallen on these leaders from various provinces, and they were a little tired and mentally not fresh. Dimly it was felt that they had to cry halt. Civil disobedience had to be stopped. But what then? Two groups took shape, one desiring purely constitutional activities through the legislatures, the other thinking rather vaguely along socialistic lines. The majority of the members belonged to neither of these groups. They disliked a reversion to constitutionalism, and at the same time socialism frightened them a little and seemed to them to introduce an element which might split their ranks. They had no constructive ideas, and the one hope and sheet anchor they possessed was Gandhiji. As of old, they turned to him and followed his lead, even though many of them did not wholly approve of what he said. Gandhiji's support of the moderate constitutional elements gave them dominance in the committee and the Congress. All this was to be expected, but the reaction took the Congress further back than I had thought. At no time during the last 15 years, ever since the advent of non-cooperation, had Congress leaders talked in this ultra-constitutional fashion. Even the Swaraj Party of the middle 20s, which itself was the result of a reaction, was far in advance of the new leadership, and there were no such commanding personalities now as the Swaraj Party had. Many persons who had studiously kept aloof from the movement, so long as it was risky to join it, now streamed in and assumed importance. The proscription of the Congress was ended by the government, and it became a legal organization. But many of its associated and subsidiary bodies continued to be illegal, such as its volunteer department, the Seva Dal, as also a number of Kisan Sabhas, which were semi-independent peasant unions, and several educational institutions and youth leagues, including a children's organization. In particular, the Kudai Khidmatgar, or the Frontier Red Shirts as they are called, were still outlawed. This organization had become a regular part of the Congress in 1931 and represented it in the frontier province. Thus, although the Congress had completely drawn off the direct action part of the struggle and had reverted to constitutional ways, the government kept on all the special laws meant for civil disobedience and even continued the proscription of important parts of the Congress organization. Special attention was also paid to the suppression of peasant organizations and labor unions, while, it was interesting to note, high government officials went about urging the zamindars and landlords to organize themselves. Every facility was offered to these landlords' organizations. The two major ones in the United Provinces have their subscriptions collected by official agency, together with the revenue or taxes. I am afraid I have never been partial to the Hindu or Moslem communal organizations, but an incident made me feel particularly bitter towards the Hindu Mahasabha. One of its secretaries actually went out of the way to approve of the continuation of the ban on the red shirts and to pat government on the back for it. This approval of the deprivation of the most elementary of civil rights, at a time when there was no aggressive movement on, amazed me. Apart from this question of principle, it was well known that these frontier people had behaved wonderfully during these years of struggle, and their leader, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, one of the bravest and straightest men in India, was still in prison, a state prisoner kept confined without any trial. It seemed to me that communal bias could hardly go further, and I expected that more prominent leaders of the Hindu Mahasabha would hasten to disown their colleague on this matter. But so far as I could discover, not a single one of them said a word about it. I was much upset by this Hindu Mahasabha secretary's statement. It was bad enough in itself, but to my mind it appeared as a symbol of the new state of affairs in the country. In the heat of that summer afternoon I dozed off, and I remember having a curious dream. Abdul Ghaffar Khan was being attacked on all sides, and I was fighting to defend him. I woke up in an exhausted state, feeling very miserable, and my pillow was wet with tears. This surprised me, for in my waking state I was not liable to such emotional outbursts. My nerves were obviously in a bad way in those days. My sleep became troubled and disturbed, which was very unusual for me, and all manner of nightmares came to me. Sometimes I would shout out in my sleep. Once evidently the shouting had been more vigorous than usual, and I woke up with a start to find two jail warders standing near my bed, rather worried at my noises. I had dreamed that I was being strangled. About this time, a resolution of the Congress Working Committee had also a painful effect on me. This resolution was passed, it was stated, in view of the loose talk about the confiscation of private property and necessity of class war, and it proceeded to remind congressmen that the Karachi resolution neither contemplates confiscation of private property without just cause or compensation, nor advocacy of class war. The Working Committee is further of the opinion that confiscation and class war are contrary to the Congress creed of nonviolence. The resolution was loosely worded and exhibited a certain amount of ignorance on the part of the framers as to what class war was. It was obviously aimed at the newly formed Congress Socialist Party. There had, as a matter of fact, been no talk of confiscation on the part of any responsible member of this group. There had, however, been frequent reference to the existence of class war under present conditions. The Working Committee's resolution seemed to hint that any person believing in the existence of this class conflict could not even be an ordinary member of the Congress. Nobody had ever accused the Congress of having turned socialist or of being against private property. Some members of it held those opinions, but now it appeared that they had no place even in the rank and file of this all-embracing national organization. It had often been stated that the Congress represented the nation, including every group and interest in it, from prince to pauper. National movements frequently make that claim, meaning thereby presumably that they represent the great majority of the nation and that their policy is for the good of all interests. But the claim is on the face of it untenable, for no political organization can represent conflicting interests without reducing itself to a flabby and unmeaning mass with no distinctive and distinguishing features. The Congress is either a political party with a definite or vague aim and philosophy of achieving political power and of utilizing it for the national good, or it is just a benevolent and humanitarian organization with no views of its own and wishing well to everybody. It can represent only those who are in general agreement with that aim and philosophy, and those who oppose this are likely to be considered by it as anti-national or anti-social and reactionary elements, whose influence must be checked or eliminated in order to give effect to its own philosophy. It is true that a national anti-imperialist movement offers a wide basis for agreement, as it does not touch the social conflicts. And so the Congress did represent in varying degrees the vast majority of the people of India, and it drew within its fold all manner of mutually differing groups who agreed only on the anti-imperialist issue, and even in regard to this there were great differences in stress. Those who, on this basic issue of anti-imperialism, held a contrary opinion kept out of the Congress and sided, also in varying degrees, with the British government. The Congress thus became a kind of permanent all-parties Congress, consisting of large numbers of groups shading into each other and held together by one common faith and the dominating personality of Gandhiji. The Working Committee subsequently tried to explain its resolution on class war. The importance of that resolution lay not so much in its language or what it definitely laid down, as in the fact that it was yet another indication of the way Congress was going. The resolution had obviously been inspired by the new parliamentary wing of the Congress aiming at gaining the support of men of property in the coming election to the Legislative Assembly. At their instance, the Congress was looking more and more to the right and trying to win over the moderate and conservative elements in the country. Soothing words were being addressed even to those who had been hostile to the Congress movements in the past and had sided with the government during the continuance of civil disobedience. A clamorous and critical left wing was felt to be a handicap in this process of conciliation and conversion, and the Working Committee's resolution, as well as many other individual utterances, made it clear that the Congress executive were not going to be moved from their new path by this nibbling from the left. If the left did not behave, it would be sat upon and eliminated from the Congress ranks. The manifesto issued by the Parliamentary Board of the Congress contained a program which was far more cautious and moderate than any that the Congress had sponsored during the past 15 years. The Congress leadership, quite apart even from Gandhiji, consisted of many well-known persons with bright records in the national struggle for freedom, men honored throughout the country for their integrity and fearlessness. But the new orientation of policy brought into the second ranks, and even the front rank of Congress, many individuals who could hardly be described as idealists. In the Congress ranks there were, of course, large numbers of idealists, but the door for careerists and opportunists was now more open than it had ever been before. Apart from Gandhiji's enigmatical and elusive personality, which dominated the scene, the Congress seemed to possess two faces. A purely political side was developing like a caucus, and the other aspect was that of a prayer meeting, full of pietism and sentimentality. On the government side there was an air of triumph, in no way concealed, at what they considered the success of their policy in suppressing civil disobedience and its offshoots. The operation had been successful, and for the moment it mattered little whether the patient lived or died. They proposed to continue the same policy, with minor variations, even though the Congress had been for the moment brought round to some extent. They knew that such changes in national policy could only be temporary so long as the basic problem remained, and any relaxation on their part might lead to a more rapid growth than otherwise. Perhaps they also thought that in continuing to suppress the more advanced elements in the Congress or in the labor and peasant ranks, they would not greatly offend the more cautious leaders of the Congress. To some extent, my thoughts in Dehradun jail ran along these channels. I was really not in a position to form definite opinions about the course of events, for I was out of touch. In Alipur I had been almost completely out of touch. In DEHRA, a newspaper of the government's choice brought me partial and sometimes one-sided news. It is quite possible that contacts with my colleagues outside and a closer study of the situation would have resulted in my varying my opinions in some degree. Distressed with the present, I began thinking of the past, of what had happened politically in India since I began to take some part in public affairs. How far had we been right in what we had done? How far wrong? It struck me that my thinking would be more orderly and helpful if I put it down on paper, This would also help in engaging my mind in a definite task and so diverting it from worry and depression. So in the month of June 1934, I began this autobiographical narrative in DEHRA jail. And for the last 8 months, I have continued it when the mood to do so has seized me. Often there have been intervals when I felt no desire to write. 3 of these gaps were each of them nearly a month long. But I managed to continue, and now I am nearing the end of this personal journey. Most of this has been written under peculiarly distressing circumstances when I was suffering from depression and emotional strain. Perhaps some of this is reflected in what I have written, but this very writing helped me greatly to pull myself out of the present with all its worries. As I wrote, I was hardly thinking of an outside audience. I was addressing myself, framing questions, and answering them for my own benefit, sometimes even drawing some amusement from it. I wanted as far as possible to think straight, and I imagined that this review of the past might help me to do so. Towards the end of July, Kamla's condition rapidly deteriorated and within a few days became critical. On August 11th, I was suddenly asked to leave DEHRA jail, and that night I was sent under police escort to Allahabad. The next evening, we reached Prayag station in Allahabad, and there I was informed by the district magistrate that I was being released temporarily so that I might visit my ailing wife. It was 6 months to a day from the time of my arrest. End of chapter 64.